Panasonic did it again. Just a couple of weeks after releasing the S1R2, they're releasing not one, but two more cameras. And one of them is particularly interesting for filmmakers. Right off the top, it is not the S1H2, but a camera that is simply coined S1II. But looking at the features, it could actually be the H model just as well.
The Lumix S1II is the newest member in Panasonic's full-frame lineup, and it's built for speed. Again, Panasonic claims that they used a brand new sensor with 6K instead of the S1R2's 8K sensor. And this one is partially stacked, which means much faster readout times, better sensitivity, higher frame rates up to 60 frames per second in OpenGate, 120 frames per second in 4K, and 240 frames in Full HD. 15 plus stops of dynamic range, ProRes and ProResRAW internally, Arri LOG C support, and much more. To see how the S1II and the S1R2 stack up, we built a dual camera rig. This will give you a lot of direct comparisons between the flagship cameras, so you can decide which one is for you. And we expose some flaws we found during our production.
The S1II seems to offer about everything for filmmakers that the S1R2 was missing, at least on paper. How does that look in real life? Let's find out. Oh, and while we're at it, we also have a quick look at the brand new 24 to 60mm f2.8 constant aperture zoom. Hang tight. When we did a review of the S1R2, our initial impression was that it could very well be the best creator camera on the market, as it has great features for photography and videography, including streaming features. Just so much technology crammed in such a small body. But being an R camera with a 40 megapixel sensor, I think it's fair to say that it falls slightly on the photography side of being a photo-video hybrid. Great if you really need both. But for someone like me that rarely takes photos at all, it is great to see that now Panasonic releases a hybrid that falls slightly on the video side. But even for photographers that rely a lot on speed, let's say in sports, journalism, or in generally very dynamic use cases, the S1II might be the better camera. An improved burst speed of up to 70 frames per second and a much quicker autofocus might be the key features here.
The S1II is really the brother of the S1R2. On the outside they are identical. They also share the same menus, ergonomics, app support, etc. For those who are not familiar with the new Lumix bodies, that means dedicated photo and video modes per dial, high-resolution EVF, and a tilt and free angle screen. There are also similarities under the hood. Both cameras share the same phenomenal stabilization, dual card recording with SD and CF Express options. Internal recording can be done in different flavors of H.265, H.264, ProRes and ProResRAW. When paired with the XLR2, the S1II can record 32-bit float audio along with your video. We will not go deeper into these features in this episode, as we already handled that in our S1R2 review, so if you want to know more, watch that one. Link is in the corner. So what is different? The S1II has a partially stacked 24 megapixel sensor, and as mentioned, Panasonic claims it's the first time the sensor made its way into a camera. The key features are 15 stops of dynamic range, the highest of any Lumix camera ever, 5.1K OpenGate filming up to 60 frames per second, 4K up to 120 frames per second, and Full HD up to a whopping 240 frames per second without crop in 10-bit. Also, the stacked sensor improved the PDAF performance in any mode, but especially in high frame rate modes. Now, the 4K 120 frames per second features PDAF autofocus, and detection modes are extended with new subject recognitions. The S1II has dual native ISOs with a base 640 and 5000 in Vlog. For professionals that might want to use the S1II as a B-cam in a higher-end production, Arri LOG C3 can be installed with the purchase of a software key.
For those that work with timecode, the S1II can receive timecode via Bluetooth with Atomos UltraSync. Like always, It's the other one. Panasonic, can you make a deal with Deity too? Please? The S1R2 will be available in June and has a list price of $3,199, so it's not much cheaper than the flagship S1R2 that is listed for just $100 more. Choosing your champion will be more based on your needs than your budget. Now that you have an overview, let's dive into what the new sensor can do and how it looks in comparison. By the way, this episode is not sponsored by Panasonic. We don't get money for this, we can't keep the cameras, none of us went to a fancy event, so we're going to tell you exactly what we think, like we always do. Our goal is to give you something that allows you to make up your own mind. But of course, we will discuss some of the specs and the results.
We always like to start with a little piece that inspires you with the possibilities that new gear might give you. As the S1II sets out to be the new lowlight king of the Lumix S lineup, Morty from Morty Films and myself set out into the forest to shoot something moody by night. Everything is shot at T1.4 on a 50mm DZO film RLES at 5000 to 10,000 ISO and no noise reduction is applied. I hope you liked that. By the way, I am a Melolantha, as you can see from my fan-shaped antenna, but you can call me Mellow. The whole storyline was made up in post as our encounter was spontaneous and we didn't even have a macro with us. So close-ups are cropped in a bit. This is where a 6K open gate master is helpful. I wish we would have had more time with the S1II. We would have been able to do something more sophisticated. As our night shoot was all about testing the ISO capabilities of the S1II, let's get right into our lowlight chapter where we also compare it to the S1R2. Do we have a new lowlight king in town? To have a better idea on how dark the forest was during our shooting, here are some behind the scenes shots that Morty did with his Komodo and an Athena at f2. I pushed those to 5000 ISO in post and applied a lot of noise reduction to make it work. It matches the perceived brightness very well. Both the S1II and the S1R2 looked so much brighter and better with 5 to 10,000 ISO and f1.4 lenses. Just unreal. You really can't believe that these were shot in very dim evening light, but the effect that our headlights have and the lights of our mics are good clues. We would have loved to haze the forest a bit, and I even got a hazer strong enough, but that one needs 2000 watts of power and we only have a 700 watt-hour power bank here. Just enough to power our lights for about 3 hours. It is nice that the pollen gave the light some interesting dynamic here. In our SR2 review episode, we were super impressed with the low light and even no light performance filming auroras. The lower base ISO didn't have the dramatic impact I expected, mostly because the noise is just so much smaller that it seems to disappear in many situations. The S1II has much higher V-Log base ISO at 640 and 5000 compared to the S1R2 that only has 200 and 1000. But when you look at the results of both cameras in the same situations using the same ISO, that doesn't seem to affect the image quality. Later on, we played with Morty's DIY deconizer, and again, I have a hard time to pick a winner between the S1II and the S1R2. I might even give the S1R2 the edge here. Just for fun, here's the same shot made with Morty's red Komodo. This is a stark reminder that there's much more to a good image quality than higher base ISO. Other factors, like the size of the noise, have to be taken into account. For the Lumix cameras, we don't apply noise reduction here, so you can push them quite a bit further than we did, especially if you use the RAW options. How good any camera looks is very situational, and if you want a beautiful scene, you have to add light. This is the scene with added light, and this is a similar scene without added light. If you think that this doesn't count as low light, well, let me put it this way. The forest wouldn't have this magical glow and base illumination. If we shot this with 800 instead of 10,000 ISO, the magic is gone. The test where we go through the ISOs shows that quite well. At 10,000 and up, we can even use Morty's base cap as a bounce, and that is gray on the inside. Let's go through the ISO of the S1II and the S1R2. Both cameras are choosing their base ISO automatically, and dynamic range extension is deactivated. Let's do the same thing with the S1R2. Here, our low base ISO is 200 ISO, so we're going to start with that and work our way up. Let's revisit this side by side and we give you our 2 cents. Given the much higher base ISO in larger pixels, I expected the S1II to take a very clear win here. But the S1R2 stood its ground. Both cameras look good up to ISO 10,000 and they're usable up to 20,000 or maybe even more in this context. Remember, this is not denoised in any way. Both the S1R2 and the S1II handle high ISO exceptionally well. If you have some light in the image and you use fast glass, you can make magic happen. Things like dim streetlights can turn a dull scene into a surrealistic dream. On the other hand, if you film your closet from the inside, it will not. Filming a wedding event at 10,000 ISO at candlelight will look good too, but not if you do that with a slow lens. And don't expect autofocus to work there. Neither from a storytelling perspective nor from a technical one. We will go into that in the chapter Autofocus. The scenes with Mellow were mostly shot at 120 frames per second and ISO 640. Proximity to the light source makes it possible, so they don't count as low light.
Our friend is here. Don't you fear, our friend is here.
By the way, the 5-inch monitor we used in the forest and in the tunnel is the Portkeys BM54. And we have a monitoring episode with a review coming next week. But it will be so much more than a review.
In that episode, we are making experiments. Can we combine so-called productivity glasses with video transmission systems to get something usable for filmmakers? And that works surprisingly well. Everybody we showed it was just...
Oh, that's so cool. Oh my God, that's so crazy.
We are going to test the system in real-life application, but we will also conceptualize a completely new way for film crews to work and communicate in the future.
So if you're interested in that one, subscribe and hit notifications. Although I don't feel like YouTube relies on that to suggest content to you anymore. Just stay tuned, we always have great stuff here.
Going through the other specs, we don't want to focus too much on low light. To give you a better comparability to a S1R2 test, we chose to go in the same tunnel location with Max again, and we even used the same lens for many shots, an ARRI's 50mm at t1.4. We also used our Frankenstein rig for side-by-side shooting, a real battle of the flagships. As it's impossible to pull focus with this rig, we used two Lumix 50mm f1.8. This will also allow us to do a very fair autofocus comparison. Let's go through the important features from dynamic range to frame rates to rolling shutter and anamorphic.
Panasonic claims 15 stops of dynamic range. Linear, that is, so don't expect that to be in Alexa space. Still, that is a lot. A full stop more than what the S1R2 can do in the dynamic range extension mode. That heavily increases the rolling shutter. So much that we really only activate it when rolling shutter is not an issue. To always have that thought in the back of your head is not a nice feeling. Now, for the S1II, the 15 stops also require a dynamic range boost to be activated. Again, that will increase rolling shutter, but as rolling shutter is much faster without the dynamic range boost mode, it is not as relevant as with the S1R2. It is worth mentioning that with the S1II, a different technique is used to get the increased dynamic range. Like with the GH6, high and low native ISO images are read out at the same time and merged. I'm not quite sure if this is a DGO sensor or just a similar approach. If you don't know what DGO is, we have an explanation about dynamic range and DGO in our The Magic Source episode, link is in the corner. As both native ISOs are used to combine the image, the S1II has no dual native ISOs in dynamic range boost mode.
This is shot on the S1II without the dynamic range boost. Panasonic claims 14 plus stops of dynamic range without the boost mode. With the dynamic range boost mode active, a stop is added and we should look at 15 stops dynamic range. In this scene we should get a little bit better roll-off from the lights. If the dynamic range boost is worth it, depends a lot on the scene. This is shot on the S1R2 without the dynamic range extension. Panasonic claims 13 stops of dynamic range without the extension mode. With the dynamic range extension mode active, a stop is added and we should look at 14 stops dynamic range. The difference in dynamic range is not very obvious in this context, neither from camera to camera nor from boost to boost. Let's put the 15 stop boosted S1II next to the 13 stops unboosted S1R2. 2 full stops should be very obvious. Once again, dynamic range is very situational and there will be scenes where it has a relevant effect. For most applications, the 13 stops of the S1R2 will do. Let's move on to high frame rates.
The high frame rate modes are really nice. For the first time, we get an open gate mode with up to 60 frames per second. Always nice. Like the S1R2, the S1II can do 4K with 120 frames per second. The S1R2 uses some form of pixel binning to do that. I can't really say if the S1II does so too. Our side-by-side should be the judge of that.
The S1II can record up to 60 frames per second in open gate mode, and that's a first for Lumix. The S1R2 can do a 6K full frame recording up to 60 frames per second, but it's limited to 16:9 aspect ratio here. For someone like me, who basically always shoots open gate if the camera allows it, it is very nice to have double frame rate options without losing the important ability to reframe for 16:9 aspect ratios. The 120 frames per second on the S1R2 looks very nice, but there's some form of pixel binning or line skipping going on for sure. Coming from an 8K sensor, this still looks pristine. Now, how does that look coming from a 6K sensor? We do have a bit of loss in resolution, so there is a shortcut for 120 frames per second 4K involved. If you shoot 120 4K in low light, something strange happens. The image falls apart in a very weird way. If you crop in, it becomes very obvious. Look at my cheek here. You can see my rapidly aging skin hailing impending death, but you can also see something else. Beside it being very soft, it is not that grainy, and there's a lot of camera processing going to reduce noise. And that seems to not agree with the pixel binning or line skipping that is applied here. I would love to hear what Panasonic has to say about this effect. Obviously, it's not a great idea to shoot high frame rates in low light, and 4K 120 can look stunning as some other shots of our show. I mean, this looks great, even 200% magnified. Still, this behavior is unexpected, and unexpected is not good. This is unusable, and I hope that Panasonic can fix that in firmware.
Here is something that the S1R2 can't do, and that is 240 frames per second. The S1II can do that in Full HD and, to my surprise, without cropping into the sensor.
240 frames per second is quite impressive for mirrorless, and Full HD can look fantastic when it's a nice high bandwidth signal. I didn't expect too much from the 240 frames per second in that regard, and indeed the 240 frames per second mode from the S1II is very soft. I didn't misfocus here, it is just that soft. The codec is 800 megabits per second, 4:2 in 10-bit. That would translate to 80 megabits per second at 24 frames per second, so the bandwidth is not the bottleneck here. When we look at Max running, look at his head passing in front of the lights, and you can spot massive amounts of binning and skipping artifacts. Resolution-wise, this is standard definition at best, but let's not be too demanding. What's cool about the 240 frames per second is that it's fast enough to slow down human movement to a degree where AI-based slow motion have enough motion resolution to work with. This is the same scene at 50% speed using Resolve Studio 20 AI Speed Warp, resulting in almost 500 frames per second. You can even push it to almost 1000 frames per second, although this will cause obvious artifacts. Still, you can definitely use the S1II for ultra slow-mo ramps like the ones in Snatch. And compared to that, the S1II looks much sharper. It's always a matter of perspective. It goes without saying that 240 frames per second falls apart in low light, even at low ISOs. Your next werewolf movie will have to do without ultra slow-mo, for now. Autofocus hasn't been the strongest suit of Panasonic, at least for video applications. While I'm quite happy with the autofocus of my S5IIX, the autofocus of the S1R2 felt like a bit of a step back. It is just not that responsive and reliable, making stupid mistakes in, at least for us, obvious situations. Sometimes even refusing to pull focus for no good reason. The performance is really dependent on what frame rate and resolution is used, and it's almost impossible to have a good overview when the camera is not your only main camera. We think autofocus has to be a no-brainer to be really useful. The interesting question here is, does the new partial stack sensor improve the situation for the S1II? Here we have the S1II next to the S1R2 on our dual camera rig. Both have a Lumix 50mm f1.8 on it, and we shoot wide open. So autofocus has to be precise. Still, I don't think it's too much to ask. We are just flying in and out of our subject at 24 frames per second. In good lighting and at 24 frames per second, both cameras work well enough. Most of the time. We are stepping up to 48 frames per second. On the S1II, we will use the new open gate mode. The S1R2 can't do open gate at 48 frames per second, so we do that in 16:9. Of course, we shot way more examples than these, but we don't want to bore you. These are exemplary. At 48 frames per second, both cameras show flaws like lagging and jumping to keep up. Workable, but not brilliant. We are stepping one more up and go to 4K at 120 frames per second. Neither the S1II nor the S1R2 support human detection at 120 frames per second, and the results show that. Again, this is just exemplary. Both cameras show generally more flaws, but the S1II is definitely on top of the S1R2. But that doesn't mean it's all bad. There are plenty of shots where the autofocus is spot on and smooth, and that is true for the S1R2 too. Consistency is the problem. To make things a bit harder, we also made a low-light autofocus test in the forest. The assumption is that if the image is bright enough to clearly recognize a human, it should be bright enough for the autofocus too. Both cameras are set to 5000 ISO, and this time we're using two Lumix 50mm S Pro f1.4, giving us a stop more light and much shallower depth of field.
Well, I would say this is almost night. Late sundown. What the cameras get is definitely way more than what I would get. f1.4 and the autofocus. Well, let's see. 5000 ISO on both. And now we do the same without the light.
We were made aware that the S Pro are not ideal for super fast continuous autofocus, which makes sense as there's a lot of glass for the servos to drive. But we are not doing extreme sports here. Just walking around shouldn't be a problem.
Do they get something?
Both are in focus right now. This one wasn't in focus just like a few seconds ago. This one is struggling now. Both are struggling now. But it's still bright enough.
I'm out of focus.
While the autofocus sometimes works, it sometimes just doesn't. I think we can agree to say the low-light autofocus doesn't work on either camera. The S1II had considerably less problems in the context, but a bit better doesn't make it reliable. Right now, it feels a lot like you have to fight to get proper continuous autofocus with the flagship cameras. I am not a great autofocus guy. Proper filmic storytelling requires manual focus pulling, but still, there are countless situations where you have to use it and you need to be able to rely on it. I don't feel that this is the case. Like here, the focus is on the camera instead of the human, and it's bright enough. Often you see that the human is recognized on screen, even the eyes, and still the camera refuses to focus on what he identifies as the subject. But it surely got a lot better since the day without PDAF. We will get there. Maybe. I might use the DJI Focus Pro integration for difficult focus situations. The stabilization of the S1II is identical with that of the S1R2, and that is stellar. One of the best features of the camera. If you give it a go and with a native lens, it can look like you had the camera on a fluid head. Most shots in this episode are handheld when the camera is not on a tripod, except for a few slides in the woods. It really opens a lot of possibilities for indie filmmakers, for BTS events, you name it. Everywhere you don't have the possibility, time or budget to do complex camera setup. Don't expect it to replace a gimbal, but I certainly don't want to live without it.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room: rolling shutter and overheating of the S1R2. During the production of our review, neither rolling shutter nor overheating was a problem.
We made a direct comparison between the S5IIX and the S1R2. It didn't show dramatic differences to me. That is, without the dynamic range extension mode. Activate that and the rolling shutter becomes a problem. Well, numbers don't lie, and the S5IIX is much better with rolling shutter. Now let's look at the S1II. How does sensor stacking affect rolling shutter? We are using 24 frames per second in open gate, and we are turning off image stabilization for this test. Of course, rolling shutter is noticeable, but so is it with an Alexa. This would be absolutely no problem in my book. Besides, you would never shake a camera in this way. For a better direct comparison, this is the S1R2 that we had on the same rig, so the movement is identical. Side by side, you can see that the S1R2 has much more rolling shutter, but I would still call this usable. Now we are turning on dynamic range boost for both cameras. This is the S1II. Rolling shutter is much stronger. I would say around the same what you see with the S1R2 without boost. And this is the S1R2 with boost. And here it gets problematic. I would recommend to only use the S1R2 dynamic range extension for slow movements like tripods, gimbals, sliders, etc. Side by side, I think the S1II is still manageable. But we usually leave it off as it's just one more thing to disturb your brainwaves during a shoot. The S1R2 is definitely wobbly, but it would still work for most of the shots you saw in this episode.
I want to talk briefly about overheating. In a review time with the S1R2, we didn't have any problems with overheating. But since then, in warmer climate and with longer filming interviews, we have encountered some heat warnings, as did many other S1R2 users. This has largely to do with what medium is in use, and some CF Express cards are getting much hotter than others. We started to use a larger Angelbird card, and that glows in the dark after shooting a while. No wonder that the camera overheats. If you have problems in that regard, look into cooler cards, turn up the van, or shoot with SD card when you can. All that helps with keeping the camera cool. With the S1II, we haven't encountered any overheating warnings yet. Knock on wood. Lumix is always nice to the anamorphic shooters, and the S1II has a whole host of anamorphic modes. New is the dedicated full frame 4x3 mode, so you can shoot with full frame anamorphic lenses. Of course, you could always have done that with any open gate mode on crop and post, but convenience is king. The problem with anamorphic is that it heavily accentuates rolling shutter, which is why the S1R2 is less than ideal for anamorphic. Let's see how the great ProRes 2x anamorphic zoom looks on the S1II to check anamorphic qualities and rolling shutter.
The S1II, together with a 2x anamorphic lower ProRes zoom and a Portkeys BM54, gives you an amazingly compact setup. Keep in mind that the zoom basically replaces a whole 2x anamorphic lens set. While the ProRes zooms are designed for Super 35, the long end covers the usual widescreen aspect ratios with full frame handsomely. With this form factor, usability and price point, you get an anamorphic setup we could only have dreamed of a decade ago. We are shooting our setup with a 3.3K 4x3 anamorphic mode in a variety of frame rates. If you're interested in the ProRes zooms, we have a whole episode creating a space age theme, and we're even taking them on a dangerous ride with racing boats. Check it out, link is in the corner. Here is one problem that I wish Panasonic would address. While Lumix cameras offer internal D-squeeze, the D-squeeze is not sent out via HDMI. This is usually not a problem when your monitor supports D-squeeze, like our Portkeys BM54 does. But the menu that the camera delivers appears wider than the image itself, and that eats massively into the monitor's real estate. This should be a quick fix in firmware.
What about the second camera that is released alongside the S1II, the S1IIe? It is basically the same camera, but it has the same sensor that you already find in the S5 II. Panasonic doesn't say what the E stands for, so I decided that it stands for economy, as it's a bit cheaper at a list price of $2,799. This will buy you all the features, ergonomics, and even the same L2 engine that you find in the higher-end models, but in combination with the resolutions and frame rates that you also see in the S5 IIX. So if you love that camera, you can get it in a new improved dress. Arri LOG C was not available while we put this video together, but we might pitch the S1II against an Arri Alexa in a future episode and check how the Arri LOG C can make life easier when you're using the S1II in a higher-end production pipeline. If you're interested in that, hit subscribe and notification.
At almost the same price, the choice between the S1II and the S1R2 is harder than we thought it would be. The much improved rolling shutter could be reason enough to go for the S1II, if you listen to a lot of people in the community. The S1II looks very good in low light, but so can the S1R2 depending on the scene and setup. The higher dynamic range didn't really make a practical difference in our shootings so far. The high frame rates look very nice. 48 frames per second in open gate is a great asset. 240 frames per second is quite limited though. Low light can do weird things, and 4K 120 frames per second looks terrible. And so does 240 frames per second, enough to get rabies. Autofocus remains something that makes us long for something better, something reliable. Last but not least, the battery life is short. It is a wonder that the powerhouses that these cameras are can run on such tiny batteries at all. Still, we always feel like we could be out of power any moment. If you do urban sports or highly dynamic content, the S1II is your weapon of choice. If you do landscape or fine art photography, the S1R2 might be the better option. For cinematic applications, both will work, but if you shoot anamorphic and very dynamic handheld, the S1II is the safer bet.
One more thing we haven't talked about is the new 24-60 f2.8. Here it is. For a quick all-rounder lens, we really like the Lumix 20-60mm lens. We used it on countless BTS shootings, events, and for work on this channel, of course, including pitching it against high-end cameras and cine lenses in our The Magic Sauce episode. Besides being super compact and giving you all the relevant focal length that you might want to use on a gimbal and handheld, the 20-60 also has a very nice close focus, giving you almost macro qualities. If you can take only one lens, that would be it. Now, it had about 3 flaws for our use case. First, with f3.5, it's a bit too slow for low light or high frame applications, and that is at the wide end. Second, the aperture is not constant, and therefore it makes you fight against it a bit. At the tele end, you only get f5.6. Third, 20mm is very wide, so wide that we barely use it. We would gladly trade the first few millimeters against something that is a bit faster. And like a good fairy, Panasonic heard our thoughts and gave us the 24-60 f2.8 that dealt with those 3 points, and that without being much larger or heavier. On full frame, 24mm is certainly wide enough unless you go for a special look. f2.8 is not really fast, but really a good trade-off for a zoom this compact. And it's constant, making it 2 stops faster at the tele end. Close focus is really good too. This will certainly be our new if I can take only one lens. Price is $999 and it will come in June.
And if you ask yourself, what is so red here? I was asking the whole time, why is his nose glowing? And it's the light shining through his nose. Rudolph, ding 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 ding, the Rudolph, ding.
Thanks a lot to Morty for helping me during the night shoot and for modeling a bit. Check out his channel Morty Films. Link is in the corner. The man knows what he's doing and he has a ton of cool stuff over there that you can watch right now.
You should really check out his Lego stop motion episode. He sends himself back to the future.
This is heavy. Great Scott.
Thank you to Maximilian Heinemann for being our talent one more time. The app tunnel must be a second home for you by now. Thank you to Panasonic for letting us try your cameras before the official release. And of course, thank you to our glorious members that make content like this possible. Give us a like if you think that we deserve one. That always helps with the algorithm. Hope to see you for our upcoming monitor experiment. Until then, I'm Nicholas, signing out with nerdlicious wishes. Shoot something amazing.